Welcome, everyone, or welcome back. Here, we're going to dive into our Dissertation 101 webinar on selecting mixed methods research or mixed methodologies. Now, this follows and builds on our quantitative and qualitative webinars where we talk about those different approaches. And to keep this one focused, we're going to be primarily looking at the considerations and constraints and advantages that are unique to using a mixed methods approach rather than a separate and uniquely qualitative or separate and uniquely quantitative research. So we will probably finish a little bit early this evening, but let's go ahead and go through the normal stuff. First of all, if you want to see the other webinars in the Dissertation webinar series, the Dissertation 101 webinar series, go to our Writing Webinars page, scroll down to the tab guide, select Dissertations and Doctoral Projects, and you'll see that right. All right. Now, we've included in the slide deck links to the webinars in this series and in the complementary Dissertation Intensive series. So if you are interested in one of those and you want to get these links, just go ahead and type your email address in the chat window, and we will add you to the list to get the slide deck. All right, so we're going to start. We're going to talk about some key terminology. We'll introduce the concept of mixed methods, talk about some specific pairings, and then finish by looking at some mixed method studies. All right, if you've been in our other webinars, you'll know that we're trying to differentiate between some things that often get confused, like interview questions versus research questions. Research questions are the larger things your study is trying to answer. Interview questions are the kind of thing that you might get an answer just by talking to a participant. A research questionnaire or instrument or survey instrument and a whole bunch of other names is the description for a standardized means of collecting information. It could be a paper form, it could be an online form, it could be a series of questions or prompts that you ask people, but the idea that you are standardizing that so you get repeatability. And repeatability and consistency are very important in research, not just for understanding your findings and looking at the right types of information consistently, but also in ensuring that your results can be applied to other situations as well. So talking about the validity and the generalizability, a lot of that starts with having consistent data, and a research questionnaire can help you do that. Now, there's also a difference between action research, which is designed to facilitate addressing some problem or issue. Action research tries to make things better, versus pure or basic research, where you're trying to understand something, and that understanding is the primary purpose. Now, almost always, if you're doing mixed methods research, it is action research or something that is designed to enable and facilitate action research. And this is important because when you are deciding what methods are appropriate for your project and you're planning the purpose, you want to make sure that you're going to be generating results you can do something with. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. Now, with the research design, what you select is going to depend in no small part on what questions you're trying to answer and what types of evidence you need to answer these questions. Is this data that's been collected already? Is it something that you're going to go out and get anew? Is this something that's been published, that is out there, collected, but not published? Or are we going to have to extract this directly from the sources, as it were, by asking people or making observations or something like that? Now, we're using methodology here to refer to the highest level choice about what kind of research you're doing. Quantitative, things that reduce to numbers. How many people go to the opera? That can be counted. How many people on average go to the opera every night in New York City? That can absolutely be counted and analyzed. Why do people go to the opera? Well, that's parts of it can be counted. We could certainly ask people in a survey, hey, do you go to the opera because it's fun, because it's an excuse to dress up and things like that? So that would be a quantitative way of looking at it. But to know what the right questions are, you probably want to talk with some people before you draft that survey. And that would be more qualitative research. Now, if you're doing these both in one, then we're starting to move into the realm of mixed methods where we're pairing these different types of information. And if your goal was, say, to come up with a list of the characteristics of a successful opera marketing plan, and then you are starting with, we're doing qualitative research followed by quantitative, yes, that's absolutely the kind of thing that mixed methods research does well. So before you select a methodology, I always recommend that you review the broader types of research methods and how they seem to align with what you want to do. Is this something where the particular one you've selected has been used a lot for this? Has been done a lot? Has it been done to death? You might not need to do a qualitative survey on something. There might be enough prior research that you can draw on to go straight to quantitative and not have to do your own qualitative to draw on that, because your quantitative study can be informed by other people's qualitative research without your having to go and do that yourself and make it mixed methods. Now, if it's something like if you're in nursing and you're doing a randomized controlled trial, by the time you get to the RCT, you'll have done the qualitative already, and we've progressed to the mostly quantitative phase of that. But it's all a question of how you're building on this, what's happened before, what do you want to do with this. In terms of a randomized controlled trial for a medication, that is something where they will absolutely want to make sure that it's decently safe before they have thousands and thousands of people taking a drug. All right. Now, I am going to call your attention to the second bullet point here. And it's saying go beyond Creswell's introductory book for research. But you may recognize some names as we go into the later slides. So Creswell has a very helpful introduction to research book that's used as part of many different programs. We use it in both of our doctoral programs and some of our master's programs here at ACU. It's a great introduction, but because it's supposed to provide an overview, it doesn't go into as much depth, as many specifics. It doesn't give you all the very precise tools and details and samples that you will get in some other works, including other works by that same author. Now, because many people, their dissertation is their first major large-scale research project, absolutely discuss your ideas with faculty. They will probably make some suggestions. And if you're reading the literature related to your topic, you'll get some ideas of what has and hasn't been done and possibly find some models to follow. All right, so let's talk specifically about mixed methods. And I will point out that that Creswell book does has a list of advanced resources. It is written specifically to empower you, including knowing where to look next once you've made a high-level decision about what kind of methodology you're going to be using. And there are a lot of subject-specific things. So if you're doing, say, research on TESOL, or if you're doing research on elementary education, or let's say second career teaching, there are actually guides that people have written about how to do research on that, and compilations of research on those specific topics. So if you need a quick overview from a more intensive resource, here are a couple examples. So the first one, the Schrauf book, that specifically talks about some ways of collecting and coordinating your data when you're doing mixed methods research. And they'll walk you things like how to do a preliminary interview to design and then evaluate your survey, and how to design a survey to do a cross-cultural comparison. And you can access that for free through the ACU library. Now, the next book is specifically on doing mixed methods research for TESOL and gives you some best practices and things like that. So if that's what you're doing, you can design your study and say, hey, I am following the guidelines Brown suggested if you're doing mixed methods on this to do X. So therefore, we're doing X. And that kind of thing not only empowers you as a researcher and gives you more time to work on the research part, but also lets you situate yourself within the stream of scholarship that has come before and write much more concisely. When you don't have to give the whole argument because other people said, hey, do this, it's a lot easier and faster. Now, there are some places where I would recommend citing Creswell. And one of these is Creswell is actually a really well-known and respected speaker to come in and who guides people through the process of their research design. And if you are looking at the readings in the EDD program, you should recognize at least 3, possibly all 4 of these names, because some of these authors of the standard introductory textbooks for research methods were approached by the National Institutes of Health to write a research guide on best practices, specifically for doing mixed methods research in the health sciences. You can download that for free as a PDF from the NIH website using this link. If you're doing work in the health sciences and you're considering mixed methods, I would look at that. Now, if you want another thing specifically on the analysis, which is something that often people find intimidating, there are resources especially for that, and I've listed one below. And if you need even more than that, let's take a look at the ACU online library portal, because that happens to have a guide that they've prepared already that gives you a set of resources for this very task. So you can see here, let me zoom in a little bit. We have the NIH guide that I mentioned. We have their larger book on mixed methods research. We have a journal article. We have another book on mixed methods research. So if you are looking to shore up your foundational understanding of mixed methods research, we've got lots of books here, many of which are available for free download or free browsing through the ACU library. All right, a few recommendations before we start. And this is taken from that NIH guide that Creswell et al. Authored. Little trivia while we're reading this. So I did actually play a performance at the National Institutes of Health Hospital last fall. It's a beautiful place. Lots of research, a lot of people with more difficult and more obscure novel health conditions there. So, all right, we have some recommendations here, and then these were made specifically for people working at the NIH, but I've highlighted a number that I think are particularly of interest to ACU students, whether they're working on education research, leadership research, nursing research, or something similar. So with the NIH application, there's a guide that they give the people reviewing them, say, here's how you should score, here's what you should look for, here's what needs to be there for it to get this score. And similarly, with the DNP and EDD programs, there are these guidebooks and checklists that your faculty will be using as they look through things. You know, if you're missing your research question section, your chapter 1 is not going to get approved. It has to be there. It is on the checklist. So make sure you have those things labeled the way it says they should. Now, provide a clear rationale for the use of mixed methods based on the study goals, questions, and aims. That's a great thing to have in your dissertation. Say, oh, I have selected a mixed methods approach because X. And that will probably be some amount of, to get this kind of understanding, we need both, and this isn't available. And such an author said, okay, this would benefit from following up with mixed methods research, et cetera, et cetera. And so you want to articulate in your writing what the benefits are of your having chosen mixed methods and how that relates to the prior literature. What you don't want to do is say, oh, we thought it would be fun to do mixed methods research. Well, give us a justification for that. And it's good to have a justification for yourself, because mixed methods research, if it's not something you've done a lot of before, for some students, it will more than double the time of their dissertation research and writing, just because it's a lot to learn if you haven't done both quantitative and qualitative before, and if you haven't done them together before. All right, formal training opportunities. There are lots out there. You can even take a pretty good class through Harvard University on mixed methods research online that runs for 8 weeks, which is, I think, a suitable way to prepare yourself for the dissertation. But if you're thinking, okay, 2 months of preparation is too long, I need to have my degree in hand in May, then maybe we want to steer you away from mixed methods and talk about how we might narrow your problem and your purpose and your research questions to be doable on that timeline. I tell people that you can write about just about anything you want for a dissertation, provided you justify it and get your committee to agree that you can do it. But you can also spend a whole lot more time writing and researching than you need to. And there are lots of other things that we want to do with our lives that are easier, better, and cheaper when we're graduated and not being charged tuition. All right, continuing through here, integrate an awareness of formal mixed methods research considerations. So you don't want to just say, oh, I'm doing mixed methods research. Tell us the specific approach and tell us why you picked that one. A mixed methods team, so that's less applicable to doctoral students than it is for a multi-year NIH grant-funded application, but it is certainly possible, doable, and in many cases recommended if there's an area, like if you're going to have a whole lot of quantitative analysis and that is not your jam, you can work with a collaborator who is. And I've seen many dissertations get approved where people are saying, oh, yes, so I worked with the stats expert at this place, or I hired someone to assist with this. So it happens, it's doable, it's fine. The goal is to do the things that need to be done. And there are all sorts of places in the data collection analysis where you might engage assistance. All right. Last one, describe the individuals on projects that hold qualitative expertise in addition to quantitative and mixed methods expertise. That includes you. As the lead researcher for your dissertation, tell us your qualifications for this. Show how you are prepared for it. And that can take many different ways. It can be about the access that you have. It can be about your prior research experience. It could be you've done research in this area before, and this is a follow-up, and so it's natural to use these different methods. So tell us that. Don't leave it implicit. Don't just imply that you have these qualifications. Tell us explicitly how or why you are qualified for this. All right, we've talked about data and participant protection in our other webinars, so I'm going to gloss over that here. I will just say this is a very important part of any research, and whether it's mixed methods, quantitative, or qualitative, make sure you take all appropriate steps to protect participant privacy, especially if we are dealing with health data or something that might have professional consequences if it came out with their name. So if you're working with human subjects, you have to be involved with our IRB. They might say, okay, this is exempt from review because of low risk, but let them make that decision, ask them first. All right, so let's hear what Creswell had to say about what mixed methods research is. Mixed methods research is both a method and methodology for conducting research that involves collecting, analyzing, and integrating quantitative and qualitative research in a single study or a longitudinal program of inquiry. The purpose of this form of research is that both qualitative and quantitative research in combination provide a better understanding of a research problem or issue than either research approach alone. So you don't want to do mixed methods just because you can. You don't want to do mixed methods because you've heard it's more vigorous. You want to do it because it will specifically enable an important, more in-depth, more complex, better understanding of whatever it is that you're trying to understand and improve. So just as a review, some types of quantitative data that you might be collecting. You might be using a survey or other instrument to ask people questions. You might have a checklist of things that you're using to assess something. You might be taking records or logs, archival data, patient records, grades for classes as from anonymized school databases. Some examples of qualitative data, you might be taking interviews, narratives that you write or collect, making observations, reviewing some documents and classifying them, looking at videos or audio recordings. Now, mixed methods, if you're using statistical data, we're often looking at, okay, how can we describe this thing in more concrete, more empirical terms? How can we compare things? What kind of relationships can we find? And for qualitative, looking at the things like text and images. Text in this case would include like transcripts of things people said in interviews. How might you code those up? How might you be looking at developing themes, looking at the relationships between themes? And we have a number of goals that we can pursue. One is to have a convergence, to have both qualitative and quantitative, giving us a better understanding of the results that we have with the data that has been collected and looking at the outcomes. Or we might be using one to lead to the other, in which case it's usually you do the qualitative data collection analysis first, and from that you develop your quantitative approach and go and collect that data, and then you use that for the final results. Or you might have that qualitative data being a lens for understanding some of the trends that you're seeing in the quantitative, which can go in both orders. Sometimes you do the survey and like, oh, we should understand why we got this, and then you do interviews rather than just having the interviews being used for the design or validation of the survey. So some goals that you might have that suggest that a mixed methods research design is appropriate. If you're trying to compare results from quantitative and qualitative research, are you using the qualitative research to help explain or understand quantitative findings? Are you exploring using qualitative research and then planning to go take those findings and see if are they generalizable? Is this thing we saw with a small sample in the qualitative research, is that true of a larger sample and hopefully of the larger population? And then you going and checking on that by doing quantitative research with the larger group. Or are you trying to develop something because whatever you want to collect and understand something is not available yet? So you're going through the process of trying to create this new instrument to find something. And it could be trying to create something that takes something into account. I was working with some students today, and we're talking about different algorithmic tools for estimating patient risk for atherosclerosis and having cardiovascular events, basically things like, say, a stroke or heart attack. And some of these will take into account other factors than others. And when you are testing something, you might say, well, hold on, there is a significant element where we don't know X. Does that, if we factor this in, do we get similar results or different results than this other things? And so that might include use of race or age or a certain medication, and you're trying to find out, is this accurate for the thing that we're trying to do? Is it helpful for the thing we're trying to do? And you also might be trying to augment an experiment with qualitative data. This happens a lot in so-called consumer research or behavioral research, where you're trying to find out, okay, what are people doing? And also, why are they doing it that way? All right, some rationales, and this is related to what we're talking about, but a different way of looking at it. Some rationales for selecting mixed methods research. You can give the insufficiency argument where you're saying, well, just using one of them by itself is not going to be enough. And you might also use the multiple angles argument saying, hey, if we use them both, we're going to find different things. Or more evidence, the better, saying, okay, well, we want to look at the maximum pool of evidence, and we don't know what will be important, but let's go and collect as much as we can of different types, and then we'll work it out later. There's a community of practice argument saying, hey, if we're doing this kind of research, we really should be doing that. And I will say, going back to the example about randomized control trials for medications, yeah, just because there are surveys that people fill out doesn't mean that they don't actually go and ask questions. And before we go further, I'd like you to take a moment and look at this slide because there are two typos that are visible right now. And I want to ask you, can you spot them? Both of them involve periods. So the first typo is in the first bullet, last sentence. It doesn't have a period at the end. The second one is on the last bullet that's available right now, that's visible, the community practice one, and there's a space before that. So one of the things you want to do as you are preparing your manuscript, whatever methodology you use, is to make sure that you are refining it as best as possible. And so that when someone looks at it, they will focus on the ideas and not on minutia like punctuation, which is important. But if you're sending it to your committee for feedback, you'd rather have them give them content feedback rather than on the proofreading. So I'm going to go ahead and change that really quick. And that is a practical reminder to all of us that we want to let people focus on the important things, and we can make that easier for them to do that if we do our due diligence to make things look professional and focused. And that's one of the reasons why when you come to the Writing Center, you might get feedback on a chapter that you weren't expecting because we spotted some things like, hey, that's something that might cause your faculty person to say, I'm not sure what this is, send it back to you. And so we'll try and let you know proactively. Eager to learn argument. So this is when you say, oh, well, it sounds great. I don't know it yet. So let me work on that. There's a time and place for that. I would suggest probably not the doctoral dissertation. You can do that after the doctoral dissertation. And then there's the intuitiveness argument. We're saying, well, it's just what we do in our everyday life. We don't only look at numbers. We don't only look at feelings. It's a combination of the two. I used to host events with speakers who would talk about the secrets of relationship success from decades of couples counseling. And one of the things that they emphasized is that it was generally a bad idea for either party in a relationship to focus on one type of information. If it's just, this is how I feel, the other person might say, well, that's your issue. I can't change how you feel about it. But if, and same thing, someone focus on the numbers. Oh, that's the second time you did X. Well, the more convincing argument, whether we're talking about change or something else, is to say, well, yeah, there are multiple things showing that this is the right thing to do. And because a lot of people will weigh those things together, you might say, well, this car is in my budget and it feels right. Well, it feels right isn't something you can really quantify so well. But that combination of, okay, quantity, the numbers work out, and it feels right, qualitative, that's a more convincing argument for most people. Now, Creswell did give a number of suggested questions that you could use to work through this. And whether you're looking at the NIH guide or one of his other books, he does provide a number of ways that you can gather the starting points of narrowing down what you want to do and collecting this information in one place. So this particular one starts with the what is the research problem, which I absolutely agree is a great place to start. Are the research methods appropriate for this problem? Agreed. Do you have access to both qualitative and quantitative data? And do you have the resources to do this or to get access in that? So I had one student at another university who wanted to do a magnificent project that involved state level stuff, working with the State Department of Education. And it was something where people even said, oh, yes, you can do that. You can come in and interview people. And we looked at the assessment and said, okay, this looks like it's a 5-year project. And not saying you can't do it. But what you did do was a much smaller thing and then got I think it was $1.5 million grant to do the 5-year thing with the whole big team. And so that's the kind of thing where you say, okay, is this appropriate? Now, the thing that got the grant was the mixed methods thing, but it's building on qualitative research that she'd done before and quantitative research that she'd done before separately. But she still did pick the mixed methods for the dissertation in the end. She picked that for that larger project where through appropriate resources. Now, there's some other questions that often students will blank on because if they've only covered mixed methods briefly in an introduction to research class, they might not be familiar with this. And this is where those other books and articles come in handy at giving you lots of examples. But briefly, our main paradigms or worldviews we might be looking at are post-positivist, which could be broken down into determination and reductionism, to empirical observation and measurement, and theory verification. If these names aren't making sense to you, don't worry. There are lots of resources that will explain this, but I would say the best thing to do is if you're considering something and you're not quite sure what it is, read a journal article that used that approach and see how that worked out in practice, because that'll make everything much more concrete. Constructivism, that can be following the understanding subparadigm, the multiple participant meanings one, social and historical construction, or theory generation. Advocacy or participatory, that might be a political paradigm, an empowerment issue-oriented one, collaborative or change-oriented, and pragmatism is usually focused on consequence of events. Again, this is where you would want to go to one of those larger book level or discipline focused things where they'll give you more examples, especially examples specific to your field. Now, again, it's usually not a good idea to learn a whole new paradigm for your first methods project. And in general, my experience is that faculty will discourage students from doing a mixed methods research project for their dissertation unless they have a lot of prior experience doing that, just because it can be a whole lot to wrap your head around and then a whole lot to research and write and analyze. All right, so related to that, but separate, is selecting a framework or interpretive lens. So I tell people the paradigm is often focused on the goals, and the framework is more on what you perceive and why. It's like, if my goal is to get, let's say, to get to Minnesota, and the framework, I go to buy some glasses. Well, if I'm driving my car, I probably don't want reading glasses. I'd want some, in my case, I probably want 2 pairs of glasses. I'd want a pair of prescription sunglasses for driving during the day and a pair of prescription non-sunglasses for driving early in the morning and at night. And that will substantially change what I might see. And because I'm not really worried about reading, say, the computer in front of me, I might wear a prescription specifically for distance rather than something else. And that helps with fatigue and helps you spot things like details on the sign that you want to. So the framework tells you how you'll make sense of information. That could be guided by a theory, could be guided by a concept, a model, something that's being grouped together, that we call it something like an advocacy lens, where there's this planned output. We're trying to look and see how can we speak for or advance the cause of some group. And we might also be looking at it as, okay, well, what kind of key background and context goes with this framework? So there are a couple of frameworks based on theories that are, shall we say, in the national parlance right now. We'll leave those aside and pick another example. So if you picked Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a model, if you take Maslow's hierarchy of needs as your framework, then we're going to be looking at things like, oh, are these basic needs met? And do we need to take care of those before we can have our students do things like, say, focus on learning? I taught for a year in Madagascar, the 3rd poorest country in the world. And a lot of students at all levels of schooling, including graduate university, would come in, and it might have been more than a day when they last ate. And that's hard to concentrate. And so when I was baking stuff to bring to class, it's like, oh, well, I could wait till the end of class, or I could let them have the bread at the beginning of class, and then they're not hungry and they're more focused and thus more able to focus on learning. So if I had approached that with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they said, oh, yes, you need to attend to that food and shelter thing first to make it a lot easier for them to focus on things like learning and self-edification and such. But it does shape your study significantly what you pick there, because there are some educational paradigms that focus on being an expert and positioning yourself there. And I could do whatever I want as an expert, but I would say that might not be the most effective thing in a paradigm where more often than not people are food insecure. Some more stuff on designs. Again, don't focus on this. This is just showing you that for certain types, some subtypes of mixed methods research, you will be weighting the evidence differently. So triangulation, you're looking at, say, what do qualitative and quantitative research show us together, which is why they're both in all caps and they're in the equal priority column. Now, in explanatory versus exploratory, it depends. What are you starting first? Explanatory, if you get the quantitative data and you say, why is it that way? And then you do the qualitative research to follow up and understand that. Exploratory goes the other way. You start with the qualitative data and then you follow up with the quantitative. So, okay, so that thing we found with the qualitative, let's find out how present it is and to what extent. And so these other things lean in different balances. And most of the resources is that we've recommended on mixed methods research will have even more detailed tables than this. So if you find a specific approach you want, they will give you the details for, okay, here's how you should be considering it, often recommending specific types of analyses. For your own edification, I enclose a formula that Creswell provided for authors for trying to plan things out. This is certainly not the only way, but it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that you'll want to be specifying in your chapter 3 when you're explaining the exact research design and approach that you have chosen and why. Those of you who have attended our quantitative and qualitative sections will notice, hey, this is longer than the similar examples for those. Yes, because there are more details that you will be bringing into practice, and therefore more things that you need to document and explain. And the way that this is proportionally about double what the similar example is for just qualitative or just quantitative, that reflects the general experience that doing a mixed methods study will involve more work, more write-up. So just keep that in mind as you plan. If you feel that your project could go either way, then I would steer you towards just quantitative or just qualitative. Any questions before we wrap things up? I did promise that we'd be finishing a little bit sooner. If you joined us and you didn't RSVP, but you would like to have a copy of the recording and the slide deck, just type your email address in the chat room and I will add you to the list to get the recording and the slide deck when those get mailed out later tonight. That's what we have for tonight. Thank you for joining us. I'll stick around if we have any questions you'd like to ask.